Property managers can make or break your investment. If you really want to scale your portfolio, you can't do everything yourself, and hiring property managers is the key to driving success. However, the important thing is finding the right property managers, vetting them, managing them, and incentivizing them. So if you want to find the right property managers to help you grow and scale your portfolio, watch the rest of this video. Hey everybody, I'm John Casmon of Multifamily Insights. I've been hosting a podcast for almost 8+ years. I've also invested with others on over $150 million worth of apartments. And I tell you this because you don't get to have that kind of scale without working with the right property managers. Now listen, I would love to tell you that we bat 1,000 and we always find great property managers, but sometimes we don't. Sometimes we have to transition property management companies, fire property managers. Sometimes they quit. A lot of times it's just not the right fit, right? So being able to identify and retain quality property managers, it's the difference between success and failure for a lot of operators. So today we're going to talk about how you actually do that. Now listen, starting out, I actually bought a 2-unit building with my wife, and we self-managed that property. So I was the property manager, and there are a lot of great things that came from that experience. First of all, I got to go through every single step of what property managers have to do. It also taught me what was hard, what was challenging, the nuances of certain things, and also what levers to pull based on the situation. To give you an example, when we had a vacant unit, think about that step. I have to document what needs to happen to turn that unit. Turning a unit, all that means is one resident leaves. Now you got to get it ready for the next resident. So what do we have to do to turn that unit? What needed to be fixed? What was the condition of the unit? So we had to track all this. And we had to have a plan for how we were going to get the property up and running and minimize the amount of downtime. Because every day that thing was vacant was a day it wasn't making me money. So how did you do that? You go through that process, making a list before that person moves out and understanding what work was needed to be done. Lining up those contractors, painters, whoever I needed. I had to line them all up. So once that unit was available, they could come in, do their job, and we can move on and get that thing leased. Then the actual leasing process. Do we have our advertising out there that's telling people this unit is available? Do we know we're going to lease it for? Do we understand who our ideal renter is? Do we have our criteria for them to rent this unit? And making sure that we have the showings and talking to people, our applications, all those processes we had to build ourselves. Make sure we had applications, making sure that it was compliant based on the city and state guidelines. So you have to go through all those steps. And once you understand that process, it's a little bit easier to hire a third party. Here's the mistake so many people make. They don't know what it actually takes to manage properties, so they can't identify where their property manager is falling short. If you don't know what it takes and you don't know what to look for, how can you really correct someone? How can you guide someone? So most investors blindly trust property managers because they don't know how to manage properties. I'm going to say this again. One of the biggest mistakes I see real estate investors making is blindly trusting property managers because they don't know what that property manager is supposed to do. So you got to understand some of the basics of what to get out of your property manager. That's going to help you create a better vetting process, to ask better questions, to learn more about these individuals, and help keep and retain quality property managers. I always tell people, whenever you're facing these issues or challenges in your business, it's one of 3 things. It's either a process issue, it's a people issue, or it's a partnership issue. Now, when I say a process issue, what I'm saying is the issue that you're facing, it just may not be a defined process. You may have something in your head of how something's supposed to go, but somebody else could think that it's very different or have something different in their head of how that process is supposed to go. And if you're not aligned on the process, you're not going to get the same results every single time. Think about it like food, right? You go to a fast food restaurant, you go to McDonald's, it's going to be consistent, whether you're at, the local one closest to you, if you're going to Atlanta or a different city or different state, they're going to give you the same process, right? The fries taste the same, the burger tastes the same because they have a system, they have the same process. Now, you go to some chefs, you go to a restaurant, and maybe the chef is great. Conversely, you may go to a restaurant where there's a great chef and the meal's fantastic and it's awesome, But you learn that that chef is leaving and he goes to a different restaurant and they bring in a new chef, and now the food's not the same. That consistency is not the same because there's not a same process, right? That's the difference here. Is now you're banking on an individual to be great as opposed to having a great process. So we start with the process, try to make sure that you understand what's going to happen, then move on to the people and identifying great people who can implement and execute that process. If you can't find that, now you need to go and identify maybe you don't have the right people, maybe you don't have the right partnerships or the right team in place to go and execute. So let's talk about finding, vetting, and retaining great property managers. Hey, we're going to start with finding because this is the most important thing. When you are finding and looking for a great property manager, first and foremost, know what you're looking for. Now, that may seem obvious and repetitive, so let me say it differently. You have to understand what results you're looking for in your property. For instance, is your property a Class A luxury apartment community? And if so, what is your objective? Is your objective to keep pushing rents? Is your objective to add some additional amenities? What does success look like? What's the business plan? Or maybe you've got a C class property and it's really about cash flow and optimizing the monthly cash flow at that property. Those are going to get you two different business plans. And based on those business plans, it may not and likely will not be the same property manager. So on that class A property, I'm looking for property managers who have experience dealing with high end tenants, high end properties, high end neighborhoods. They are different. Those tenants require a different level of white glove service. They have a different expectation of what it means to rent versus someone who is maybe in a C class property, which is more affordable or working class. And they're not as concerned with some of the bells and whistles. They want to pay as little as possible, still get a decent apartment, but they're not as concerned with some of the things that class A luxury renter is concerned with. And you have to have the property manager who has the mentality to deal with both. Some of the Class C tenants, they may ruffle some of the feathers of your average person, right? They may be a little rough around the edge. They may have some more colorful language. They may get up in your face. And you need to have someone who understands that and has the personality to navigate that. Some people don't. You might need thick skin if you're going to rent Class C properties, especially if you're dealing with any kind of subsidies or anything like that. Like sometimes they may not have the rent payment. Sometimes they got a lot going on in their lives. And you need to have a strong property manager who can take some of that feedback and take maybe some of the verbal shots, not literal shots, but verbal shots from those residents and be able to hold their own and still stay firm with the expectations to implement and enforce the rules and the expectations of that community. And sometimes when a class A, those folks don't have that. They're a little bit more of almost like a waiter at a restaurant or a white glove service. So they're order takers. They can, oh, this isn't working. Okay, let me call maintenance and get them out there. They're not the person who's going to sit there and stand and say, hey, listen, you're 2 weeks behind on rent. If you don't get this over by this date, this is what's going to happen. Or going over there to break up parties. Like it's a different mentality. I'll tell you a short story, man. I had an 8 unit building that I bought in Chicago, and I hired a phenomenal property management company, very well respected. My property, it was 8 units, Class C property. I asked them, hey, here's what we're getting. Do you guys think you can manage it? They said, absolutely, no problem. Well, we struggled on that property. And part of it, the reason was they were used to managing Class A and B plus type properties. This was a pure C. This was definitely a Class C property, not C plus, not C minus. It was just C. And we had half the units that were on subsidies, still quality residents, just on subsidies. But with the subsidies, you had to have inspections. And with the inspections, there are a lot of details that my property management company kept missing because they weren't used to it. They didn't understand the railing needed to be screwed in. It couldn't be loose or wiggly. They didn't realize that all of the smoke detectors had to be working and operational and not having that beeping sound. And when the inspector came, if it failed any of that, we didn't get the rent for that month. Now we could fix it and call them back out, but we didn't get rent for many months because we failed inspections and they didn't understand how to make sure we were prepared in the first place for the inspection, or how to quickly make sure we were fixing those issues so we can maximize our rent collection. That was just one of them. We had trash at the property. I would go and, those little circulars you get on a weekly, well, they would be kind of in the yard there. We had a little fenced in yard. So they would be in the yard next to the mailbox, just floating around with the wind blowing. And I would always pick it up. And I'm like, how come every time I come here, I see this? Well, again, in their Class A properties, that's not an issue. When you're dealing with Class C properties, sometimes people are not going to throw everything in the trash. They're just going to throw it on the ground. And I ended up walking the grounds a lot of times, picking up trash. That was not something that they did. So these are the kind of things you have to understand when you are hiring a property manager. It's what kind of property manager? Are they hands-on or are they more of an office property manager? Because with Class C, you need somebody hands-on. You need someone who's going to be at the property, who the tenants are going to know, but know their face, know their name, talk to them on a regular basis. With Class A, that's not the case. Most of the time, there's little interaction because someone's just going to pay their rent. If something happens where they need a maintenance request, they're probably going to go online and just fill out a little form and submit it, and it gets handled. So they may not have as many interactions with the property manager as on the Class C side. You see a lot more of that interaction where they really need to see them. They kind of need to kind of police and manage the property. So it's just a little bit of a different concept. So the first and foremost thing, you have to understand, what kind of property manager do you really need at this property? All right, so if you're serious about growing your portfolio and taking lessons like this, make sure you join our multifamily mastery community. Now, inside, we're sharing free resources, guides, tools, and the same strategies that we're talking about here, but we're going much deeper, and you have the chance to collaborate and learn from other community members. And we're giving you the insights, tools, and resources for you to grow and scale your portfolio. So if this is something you're interested in, make sure you click that link in the show notes down below. All right, so how do you manage property managers? Well, the first thing is you have to have frequent conversations. This is going to depend on you, your personality, the size of the assets, and how much you have to talk about. But I suggest starting out having weekly phone calls. Okay. You may need to have daily phone calls depending on the property and what's going on. But weekly to start, just because you want to get into the flow. And sometimes things get lost if you wait too long. I know some people do like monthly meetings or quarterly meetings. You can get to that. Starting off, I think the more frequent conversations, the better. On our larger stuff, typically that means weekly. On your stuff, maybe it's less frequent. I had a 28 unit building where we were talking every day or every other day, just because there was so much going on and so many details. And that was actually problematic. And actually, I want to tell you, that's one of the things that may be shocking to you. But when you have a larger portfolio and you have scale, you can actually manage it more efficiently and have less frequent meetings because you're not having to talk about every little detail that pops up. You're really managing the manager at that point. So when you have a 200 unit property, I don't need to sit and talk about, the lady in 32A had this maintenance issue. Like, that's your job. I hired a full-time property manager whose job is to solve that. I just need to know what happened, what the outcome was, what it means to me. Is it going to impact the overall numbers of business moving forward? And if she runs into or they run into any situation where they don't have the answer, that's what our conversations are for. When you have a 2 unit or a 6 unit, you're getting that phone call. Hey, the lady in 32A is putting in her notice, or she has this issue. All right, because you're doing a lot more handhold, a lot more guiding on that, right? So that's where it becomes a challenge, but that's also why we like scale. I digress. So what does it look like when it comes to managing? So you have your meetings, you're talking about key things that are going to impact the business. This comes down to the process I was talking about before. So when you have these meetings, you want to make sure you have a clear process of what you're covering. I like to start with our KPIs. What are we looking at? That's occupancy first and foremost. How many people are at the property? What's our vacancy? Do we have any move-ins? Do we have any leases signed? I want to understand that, right? So we're starting into our KPIs with occupancy. Then we're going into our forecast of what we expect. If we're running into any issues there, we're going to talk about that. Hey, we're getting a lot of showings, but we're not getting any applications. Okay, now we're going to dive deeper into that to understand what the issue is and what we can solve. If we, um, maybe we're having tenants move in, but after just a few short months, they're either not paying rent and have to be evicted or they're moving out. Okay, we got an issue that we've uncovered. Now we got to really dig deeper and peel back the onion, understand why is this happening more than one time. So we're going to start to uncover issues based on some of those things. I like to start with occupancy and then start to drill down to the actual financials after that. We'll get into maintenance tickets, issues at the property, and other things that we can pay attention to as well, meaning like upcoming projects. So we may have like spring cleaning projects or things we're keeping our eye on, things that we may do quarterly. So we'll have a list of stuff like that that we may want to do as well. So we get into those conversations, we're managing them. And every time we're doing that, we're leaving that conversation, making sure that the property manager has a clear vision of what our expectations are, where their focus should be over the next week or 2 weeks or whatever that time frame is. And if anything does come up that catches our attention or we need to talk about, we're not waiting for that scheduled meeting. That's something that you can always text me, email me, call me. Let's have that conversation. So they understand what those things are. And then they also know when it comes to what we need to spend on repairs and maintenance issues, there's a threshold. So if it goes above $500, that's a call for approval situation. That's not something they can just go out and spend. Again, when you're starting out smaller properties, you may want to lower that threshold because maybe $250 is that number that you don't want them to spend. You also want to put parameters in on, the vendors that they use. Again, some people, they just want to hire their buddies or hire their brother-in-law or whatever the case may be. You want to make sure you got the right people doing quality work so that you're not just really a part of this game where they're moving money to pay their friends. And that happens probably more common than you think. So you definitely want to pay attention and understand who the vendors are that you're working with and pay attention to the billing and make sure you're paying a fair price as well. So, talk about managing them. Again, there's got to be a feedback loop. There has to be a process to give them grace to learn and to grow and to scale and develop those processes and to follow clear processes whenever possible. If you're working with a property management company, then you also want to make sure that you're bringing in that regional manager into those meetings. I tend to like my regional managers to be in as many meetings as possible just so that there's transparency. If I have a great property manager, I'm not as concerned, but I want my regionals to be there because they may have either resources or experiences of things they're seeing across the marketplace or other properties. And quite frankly, I think it's just really important for us to all be on the same page. What you don't want to have happen, and I've seen this multiple times, where you're working with the property managers talk to their boss, the regional manager, but we're not all on the same page because the regional manager has a different set of objectives than what I have. So now this property manager is kind of getting caught in the middle, getting direction from both parties, and they don't align. So that can be a conflict of interest. In an ideal world, you would get that resolved. But there are times where, especially if you are splitting resources, there's times where that regional manager may want to prioritize either another property or something else that helps them in their bottom line. Or when you get into budgets and understanding, hey, here's the things that we want to spend money on. And they've got all these programs and initiatives that they want to implement, and they're not necessarily the most cost efficient thing for you as an owner. So you get into this back and forth a little bit. Same thing with maintenance and same thing with just managing your costs and taking a look at how the property's performing across the portfolio. You've got to stay close to those KPIs and make sure you understand what's happening at that property. All right. Now, we've talked about finding great property managers. We've talked about managing them. Now you got to talk a little bit about retention. And this is probably the hardest part. Okay. And the reason for that is you have to understand everyone's motivations a little bit different. Money is obviously going to be a big thing for everyone. So when you're setting your budget, when you're identifying compensation structures, you're going to have to understand how much you can invest in property management. Most property managers are going to tell you kind of, hey, here's what we charge, here's what we expect. You can always negotiate. And certainly, if you have options, you can use that leverage. But you may find someone who you really like and you want to keep them. And maybe they want to get a higher cut. I would strongly urge you to put those incentives or any compensation structure tied to your objectives as well, right? This is still a newer concept for a lot of people, but try to align it with your goals and your interests. So if you make more money, you hit certain KPIs, they can grow and scale and get a bonus. We like to do maybe end of year bonus for our leasing agent or our property manager based on hitting certain objectives. Sometimes they're clear and direct, and sometimes it's a little more loose based on just kind of a feel, which we should probably tighten some of that up. But either way, you definitely want to make sure that you're incentivizing people to stay. One of the other things that I've seen is this may seem really simple, but you've got to give positive feedback. These property managers are dealing with stuff every day, right? They got tenants coming down them. They've got maybe a boss, regional manager who's on them. Obviously, you as an owner and investor, you're likely having more conversations around the issues and challenges and things that need to be fixed, as opposed to just singing their praises. You've got maintenance technicians who are probably just taking stuff from them, and it's just a lot. They're being asked to quarterback this entire property and to play the role of a general manager, but they don't necessarily get the praises as often. So make sure you're taking the time to acknowledge what they're doing well. Make sure you're taking the time to thank them, to send them stuff during the holidays. Just keeping them in mind. Praise is something that is really important for property managers, especially since they spend so much of their time dealing with complaints and dealing with people who are not satisfied with what's happening, and they're constantly being asked to solve those problems. So don't forget to thank your property managers. Don't forget to highlight them when they do something amazing. Don't forget to acknowledge when they're crushing the KPIs and hitting in these key metrics here. So make sure you're thinking about them as people and not just barking orders at them as well. And then from a compensation standpoint, make sure you align it. They should be growing with you. They should be getting raises and pay bumps and different things as well. So make sure that as you're growing your business, you're putting them in a position to grow as well. The last thing I will say, if you have a plan to sell your properties at some point, make sure you understand how that impacts them. For a lot of people, what they are hearing is, oh, I'm going to lose my job, right? I'm going to lose my client. I'm going to use this account. So you want to make sure you are thinking about either A, how to retain them or pass them along to the new owner, how to move them to other properties that you have, or at least giving them enough time where they can work through their options. But that's something that can be a challenging situation for owners. Is we know that, hey, you may not own this property forever, so they're constantly having to think about like protecting themselves and protecting their own career. So take care of your property managers the best you can. If you find great ones, if you can manage them and you can retain them, you can definitely set yourself up for success as a real estate investor. So listen, we talked about these things. If you like this content, share it with somebody else who you think will get some value out of it. And if you want more of this kind of a conversation and you want to be more of a two-way interactive street here with some other like-minded individuals, join our multifamily mastery mastermind. We're going to get together, talk about these great ideas, talk about best practices, strategies. I'm going to give you some tools, templates, resources that you can utilize to grow and scale your portfolio. So make sure you check that out. There's a link below. I will see you next time.